Van life is supposed to be about freedom, escaping the daily grind, waking up to beautiful landscapes, and living life on your own terms. But when the sun sets and you're parked in the middle of nowhere, the road can turn into something much more terrifying. Tonight, we bring you 3 terrifying true stories from vanlifers who encountered horrors they never could have imagined. Lock your doors, and let's begin. Story 1. I had been van dwelling for about 2 months, staying around the North Seattle/shoreline area. I had found a few good spots that I was rotating around when I came across this really perfect, uncrowded spot on a residential street. My rule of thumb was that I wouldn't spend more than 2 days in a row in one spot. Anyways, first night there, I parked around 8 p.m., got comfy, watched my TV show, stayed up till 1 a.m., fell asleep, woke up, went to work. It was a good night. The second night was a bit different. It was normal up until midnight. I was laying there watch-free solo when this blacked-out car pulls up right behind me. The owner got out of the car and instead of walking to a house, they proceeded to walk to my van and start staring at all the windows and locks while I was staring at them through the windows. They got super close and kept walking around. My heart was pounding in my chest. I can't believe I am 1. In my van and 2. Awake to witness this. What if I was sleeping and this happened? I got scared, hopped in the driver's seat and drove off. I never returned and have no idea what I avoided, but it was scary for me. Story 2. I was camped out up north, up past Tionesta, Pennsylvania in Forest County. Did a day hike along the river with my pup Asha, some drone flying and just generally meandering around. I'd like to fancy myself an aerial photographer and I try to get memorable shots and video with my drone, so between walking the fire cuts and taking video we still managed to get a dozen miles from my silver lining, my van's nickname. Now, I'm a woman out and about alone in the wilderness. Lots of wild country and the Allegheny National Forest, wilderness. Not like the crazy out west, perhaps, but plenty of stuff to get lost in. But I wasn't worried, grew up outside of Pittsburgh and had canoed and camped overnights on the upper Allegheny River 2 score times at least. Had my pup, my .38 S&W, and weirdly enough, since I was familiar with the area, I didn't feel out of sorts at all. Completely irrational, but there it is. I ran my drone out about 3 miles over a ridge line to an isolated and long-abandoned fire watchtower, decrepit and abandoned, but I figured it would maybe be an excellent shot, especially against the setting sun. A sort of man's work falling back into nature. Entropy always wins, with the sun setting and giving the whole area an ethereal glow. I flew my drone up the valley, watching on my screen, and approached the tower from the east, planning on setting it for an automatic circular flyby at first for video and then coming back for some hovering and still shots. And I noticed a climber in a sort of mottled greenish jumpsuit standing on the platform staring towards the sun. I was floored for a second. I'm a dozen miles from the road and hadn't seen anyone else all day. Recovering, I slipped the drone into manual and pulled it back toward me, away from the climber. I didn't want to startle him nor ruin his contemplation with propeller noise. It was getting late on top of that, and I wanted to be back at my van by dusk anyways. When the sun drops behind a ridge, it gets dark and cold very quickly, like some dark deity threw a switch. We get back to the van right at dusk, both pretty tired. I watered and fed the pup, set her bed up, and cooked up some eggs and hot sauce on the range. Next, I policed the site for any garbage that I may have accidentally left, as I intended on heading back down the mountain at first light. I set the insulated covers in the windows and dumped the drone video into my laptop to see if I had any usable footage or interesting photographs. Mostly it was just green trees and river, and while very pretty, nothing remarkable. So I fast-forwarded to the goal of our hike to see if I had anything from the fire tower, and by now the guy on the tower had piqued my curiosity. There was something about the brief flyby that was bothering me, and I wanted to see what this guy was doing. I pulled the video up and slowly ran through it. The drone approached the revolving effect as it began its programmed circuit around the tower, and it struck me what had bothered me. I'd been to the base of that tower a few times and knew for a fact there was no way to the top, some 150 feet or so in the air. The stairs had long ago been ripped down for scrap or safety or both. And this guy? This figure had no climbing gear. Just someone in a camisole standing on a remote tower like he was dropped by helicopter. The drone closed on the tower and the figure grew a bit on the screen, and right as the drone stopped and began to return under recall, the man turned and looked directly at the drone, and when I say this I mean it felt like he was looking not at the drone but right through it at me, and the hair stood up on my neck, literally, when I realized another bizarre detail. He didn't have a face, no discernible face at all, just a leathery pale oval, and it was definitely staring at me somehow. I knew it as surely as I know my own name. And then because I struggled rationally and my mind raced to sort this, and I thought maybe it's some guy wearing a balaclava and one-piece camo suit and who somehow procured himself 150 feet into the air and IT pointed at the drone. At me. I lost my shit here and slammed the laptop shut and decided I was breaking camp right fucking now. And where were my keys? Of course, the ignition, where I left them. There came an ear-shattering scream from behind me, and I nearly wet myself. My dog Asha had dropped into her bed asleep after eating, exhausted from the day, and now she was simply shrieking, screaming, making a sound unlike I'd ever heard her utter, like pure mindless fear, and her eyes were rolled back into her head with her whites exposed. She stopped as quickly as she started and scrabbled backwards away from the rear of the van so violently she collided with the stool I was sitting on and almost knocked me to the floor. Her panting did not drown out a scrape-paw-scape sound that I could hear on the gravel on the pull-off. A scrape-paw-scrape that was very clearly, almost casually, coming closer to the van. I have on the outside of my van LED security motion lights. Amazing devices, solar-powered, and I put some magnets on the back and soft felt so they would not harm the paint when put up or removed. Excellent for camping and easily removed for travel or stealth mode. And the rear one clicked on and I knew it was out there, approaching the van. I was paralyzed with fear and beginning to hyperventilate and feared I might pass out. And I heard a voice in my head state clearly, "You pass out, you die." The scrape continued slowly around the side of the van as the passenger side light kicked on, and I could see a shadow of something moving in the tiny gaps where the insulation didn't quite cover the whole window. Asha was whimpering now, and I knew that it knew for sure there was someone inside the van, that I was in there, that we were. There was a pause, and then the door handle was jimmied, and thank God my nightly routine was to secure all locks. The thing let loose an unearthly screaming that Asha matched as she peed herself, and I blinked into the driver's seat and started the engine. Keys left in the ignition when camping as a precaution. I have no memory of getting into the seat or starting the engine. I do recall vividly something smashing on the rear doors as I slammed the van into reverse, and the camera came on and it was there, behind the van standing as if daring me to run it over. I realized even in the rear camera view that this thing definitely had no face and the close-fitting jumpsuit was in fact its skin, or hide, and I knew that it somehow was seeing me through the camera. I watched mesmerized, and its head tilted back and back until its neck was exposed and a red line slid. A part opened, not a mouth, just a black maw lined with red, and it screamed at me again with an unearthly rage. I screamed, the dog screamed, and I floored the van hoping to run the thing over, and it just sort of morphed out of the way. It did not jump or move, just moved out of the way like an image does on a soap bubble or the way your reflection moves on a funhouse mirror. I backed onto the road and dumped it into drive, floored it, and from the camera I knew the lay of the road for a few dozen yards, so I waited a few seconds before I ripped the front screen off. The road was clear and I accelerated as fast as I could and didn't stop until I got to Erie, where I got us a room at some travel lodge. Not ashamed to admit I slept, fitfully, in the bathroom with the dog, .38, and the door locked and barricaded. I don't talk about this incident at all IRL, but it's not the first oddity that happened to me on the river, but it sure as heck is the most spooky. I'll not go back there under any circumstances for any sum of money. Story 3. We were traveling from the lower 48 to AK and traveling on the Alcan. We stopped in a town called Watson Lake in British Columbia. The American and Australian couple had been found murdered about a week earlier, so we were already sort of on edge since my hubs and I were doing the same trip they were, and the killers hadn't been found yet. We had horrible Chinese food at a restaurant next to the hotel, and we headed into the van for the night. Watched Bob's Burgers, read a little, and it finally started getting dark around 10 p.m., so we decided to go to sleep. I woke up to the feeling of the van being rocked back and forth like someone was trying to tip it over. I kept listening, and it felt like someone was trying to open the driver's side door. I woke my husband up and told him to put on pants and that someone was trying to get into the van. Once we started talking, the rocking/noise stopped, and we heard gravel crunch around the van as we looked out the window, and we watched a guy in a black hoodie walk away from the van. I watched him cross the street, and then he just sat on some steps in the dark. I could see the outline of his body and his cigarette in the dark. I grabbed my binocs and then saw there were two other guys sitting with him. One was drinking out of a handle too. I finally called the cops, and then we both sat there for a good 20 minutes before I saw him get up and walk toward us again. He walked under a street lamp, and at that point I could see he was wearing a bandana to cover his face. My husband turned on our headlights and he stopped dead in his tracks and then turned and crossed the street again. Him and his buddies walked out of sight, and then we saw the cop car go by looking for them. We didn't have enough gas to get to the next town over, so we were stuck. The cops called me back and said they'd just arrested one of the guys. BC, he was high on crack and a well-known criminal in the town. We asked if we could sleep at the station that night, and they said yes, and we hauled ass out of there as soon as we could get gas in the morning. Van life may offer freedom, but some roads lead to something much darker. Have you ever had a terrifying experience while traveling? Let us know in the comments below. And remember, if you're parked alone at night and you hear a soft tap on your window, don't look. Stay safe out there, and until next time, keep the lights on.